Welcome back to the Muscogee History course. This video covers contact to the removal period. The images and reproductions we used may not be all historically accurate, but represent time periods. In Creek trading in the 1540s, Hernando de Soto invaded Muscogee lands, and he was followed by numerous other explorers and traders and settlers. The Europeans brought deadly diseases such as smallpox and measles and plague. And when you think about the Muscogee people as healthy as they were and immune to any of the diseases that were in their area because they had none, the Europeans brought deadly diseases because they weren't as clean. The traditional way of our Muscogee people was that they bathed often. And they ate only the freshest of vegetables and herbs, and the meats they ate were fresh or they were dried. But when the Europeans came, a lot of them didn't bathe at all, and they had lost probably their fire, their clans they lost, their names they lost. The trade with the English began around 1670 with the settlers at Charlestown, and Creeks traded captives and deerskins for European goods. And of course, in the 1600s, one of the great things that happened with Muscogee people was that they adopted some of the horses and guns and metal utensils and cloth. That really changed their whole way of living because they could ride the horses and go long distances and hunt. They could use guns that could kill more than the bow and arrows that they used previously. When the slave trade was outlawed and the colonies' focus shifted to deerskins, and yes, the Muscogee Creek people had slaves. They even had their Indian slaves, maybe Iroquois slaves, that other Native Americans that they captured during war or skirmishes, they would bring back as slaves to do work in the Confederacy. Trade soon developed between the Creeks and the English and the French and the Spanish. We had a government of Muscogee people that were aligned to leadership, and they began to understand the importance of working with the English, the French, and the Spanish. The French constructed Fort Toulouse near present-day Montgomery, Alabama, and Hickory Ground in 1714. And to promote diplomacy, the Creeks agreed to friendly relations with all three of their trading partners, England, France, and Spain. Creek tribal leaders established commerce with their neighbors to build the tribal's economy. The Creek land secessions is what I would consider happened primarily in the 1700s. 1733, the earliest, were with the Lower Creeks, who permitted General Oglethorpe to establish a colony in Georgia. Creek leaders recognized the inevitable pressure of the Europeans and negotiated treaties in the best interest of the Creek people as possible. Other nations entered into treaties with the Creek nation, as did England in the Treaty of 1733, which promised friendship, protection, and acknowledged that the area doth by ancient right belong to the Creek nation, even though they permitted that right to the Creek nation. The Creek nation always gave up something in every treaty that they signed. A treaty to them was a binding instrument of parties with treaties making powers governed by international law. There were three assumptions in this Indian treaty. Both parties were treaties and they were sovereign powers. The Indian tribes had some form of transferable title to the land, which quite often referred to as an aboriginal title. And the acquisition of Indian lands was solely a governmental matter. The federal government in the first treaty with the Creeks was the Treaty of New York in 1790, and it guaranteed Creek claim to their land. It promised protection against Georgian encroachment. And 1786 were approved in the treaty also. Alexander McGillivray, who was Creek and Scottish and a mixed blood, of course, he was a dynamic leader of the Muscogee, and he worked to change the Great Council from a loose association of town governments to a more centralized, forceful, and active institution. To effect this change, however, required that the towns, the tribal towns, relinquish their control over political and cultural life. Apathaholomiko was the leader of the upper Creek towns of Tallahassee in the last decades of the 18th century. He opposed Alexander McGillivrary's plan to unite the Creek towns and do away with tribal town government. You can see on the slide that the land cessions by treaty, there are 12 treaties that took several million acres of land from the Muscogee Confederacy. The first one you see was 1733, which is a small amount of land there that faced the Atlantic seaboard. You can see the large portion of land that we gave up in 1814 in the battle at Horseshoe Bend, which encompassed 23 million acres. So you see all of the land cessions and the dates which we gave up land as the white settlers encroached continually upon Georgia and Alabama land. You can also see the original lands of the Creek and what incorporated up into the formation of the United States. The Creek leaders had entered into treaties with European nations. However, after the Revolutionary War, McGillivray negotiated with the United States to obtain federal recognition and protection. You do understand that the Revolutionary War took place during this period, and a lot of activity was going on other than our nation and what our nation was doing as a structural government at that time. Some of the outside influences of the Muscogee people zeroed in primarily on the treaties during that period. The Treaty of 1796 allowed the United States to establish military or trading posts and set boundary lines with the Choctaw and the Chickasaw. But all during an 81 period, 18 treaties were ratified between the United States and the Creek Nation. The first treaty was probably with a postal trail through the nation just to deliver mail. But the Treaty of 1802 allowed for garrisons to be established on Creek land, and the Treaty of Washington in 1805 established boundaries, a military post, and a road from Okmulgee to Mobile. Lands were ceded under both treaties, and so you can see that what was simply a trail to deliver mail became a military road, and then garrisons. And a garrison is different than a fort. A garrison would be where soldiers might need to spend 2 or 3 days to rest up, whereas a fort was a large portion of land that was set up to protect the people that, and the soldiers and the families that were in the fort. To preserve the traditional existence, the Creeks emulated as much as possible their white neighbors to convince this alien society that Native people were being assimilated in hopes that they would be left alone and in peace. Based on what he saw among the Creeks, Benjamin Hawkins, who was an Indian agent, believed that he was bringing civilization to the Muscogees. Benjamin Hawkins is often referred to as the one who catapulted the last Muscogee Wars against Andrew Jackson at Horseshoe Bend. And you have to understand that Benjamin Hawkins was only a puppet, because there were people that much higher in government that were looking at Muscogee lands and wanting them for their own. Benjamin Hawkins also tried to influence the Muscogee people into individualism, owning their own land and having their crops, and steel plows introduced to the Creek people in the 1790s. Individualism was something that our people did not understand. All of the land that they had and all the produce that they had and the hunting which they went into also to help their people was all communal. But in 1811, Tecumseh, who was Shawnee, who was a genius when it came to organization, traveled many miles across the Creek Confederacy and other nations and tried to bring revolution to the Native people in that area and push the white man into the Atlantic seaboard. When Tecumseh came to Muscogee Confederacy, he came to Tuckabachie, which was a major Creek population and a political center located on the west bank of the Tallapoosa River. He was asking the main Upper Creek to join in his revolution against the United States. A group of Quasati warriors accompanied Tecumseh back to his home in Shawnee Territory. And in the spring of 1812, on their return home, they executed several white settlers in Tennessee. As a result of that, the Secretary of War instructed the Tennessee governor to retaliate, which was a precursor to the conflict between the Creeks and Andrew Jackson. The effects of war on the Muscogee Creek were horrifying, to say the least. The Redstick War was in 1813 through 1814, and the more traditional Creeks were against the new life that was being introduced. The encroachment of whites into the traditional lands of the Upper Creeks instigated the Redstick War. This conflict was looked upon by the United States as to weaken the Creek people by dividing them and pitting them one against another. They felt like if they could divide the Muscogee people, they could conquer them. That was their ultimate design, and motivation was to destroy the Muscogee Creek Nation and to acquire vast amounts of resources. But the Muscogee Creek would defend their land, and the Patriots exhibited great bravery. Redsticks were a group of warriors that were very cognizant of being patriotic to their traditional ways. And the battle between Andrew Jackson at Horseshoe Bend showed their great bravery. The outnumbered forces of the Redsticks unsuccessfully defended their encampment against the Tennessee militia and the Cherokee. There were around 100 Cherokee that fought with Andrew Jackson, and some allied Creek warriors also. Primarily, they might have been mixed bloods and had lined themselves with the white man's way. The day that they had this war, the Redsticks were lost in battle defending their homeland. As a matter of vengeance, 22 million acres of land was determined to be equivalent to the expenses of the war, and was ceded to the United States government under the Treaty of Fort Jackson in 1814. Primarily, they had said that the war cost was around $300,000, and so that was the price. It was 22 million acres of beautiful land, and which they took for the purpose of the expense of that war. Some treaties dealt primarily with land cessions, such as the Treaty of 1818 and 1821. The Muscogee strengthened and centralized their national council by codifying tribal laws in 1818. A law was passed that no tribal lands could be sold without the approval of the council under the penalty of death. But in 1825, William McIntosh, he was a speaker of the lower towns, and remember, the lower towns aligned themselves primarily with white influence. He signed the Treaty of Indian Springs, which ceded all Muscogee lands in Georgia and 2/3 of their Alabama lands in return for new lands in what is now Oklahoma, or then was called Indian Territory. McIntosh was executed under the National Council laws, and a new Treaty of Washington in 1826 declared that the 1825 treaty was null and void as far as ceding Georgia lands. The remaining lands in Creek Nation were ceded in the Treaty of 1827. In April 2014, the Muscogee Creek Nation returned to Horseshoe Bend to commemorate the 200th anniversary of that battle. The Muscogee Creek Nation brought some closure to that part of their history by visiting their homeland and offering prayers and songs from their nation to the warriors that fought in that war. The Tallapoosa River ran red with blood where horses and men could not drink from that water of that river. The 800 warriors who died were left to rot in the ground, and settlers years later saw the white, sun-bleached bones of our Redstick warriors. And now we are going to listen to Principal Chief George Tiger speak at this commemorative ceremony.
The song says, there's an appointed land, an appointed place that we're going to. But in the end, we'll be with our Creator. History records that with not only Muscogee Creek people, but all indigenous people of this land, had periods of adversity. Through adversity, we gained strength, but as Muscogee people, we overcame these adversities. And you know, a battle may have been lost at this site 200 years ago, but as Muscogee people, we're still here. Yesterday, as I was flying in, I could see, as we were getting ready to land, why our forefathers fought so hard for these lands. And I can see why the non-Indians fought even harder. But you know, as Muscogee people, because of who we are today, the ashes, the fires of our traditional people at our ceremonial grounds is strong as ever. Our churches, where many of our songs that we sing in those tabernacles are sung with pride, and those songs are stronger than ever. It is said that it's Muscogee, whether we come from our ceremonial grounds or our traditional churches, but as one, there's no other nations in this country that can say with pride that we certainly have overcame. It's also stated that as Muscogee people, we're very strong spiritual people. As we're getting ready for our season with our ceremonial grounds, as our churches get ready for their summer season, you see a parallel there that was brought to Oklahoma from our motherlands here. I don't believe that we'll ever lose those. We will never lose the tradition and culture that's been handed down through generations. And as we look back to today, I truly believe that as I stand before you, the spirit of those red sticks stand with me. As I stand before you today, the spirit of those who fought so hard stand with me today. Earlier when that wind blew up, I leaned over to the speaker and I said, "Speaker, their spirits are still here." In landing here yesterday, I could sense that it was going to be emotional. It wasn't too long ago when we held a meeting at one of our ceremonial grounds and we talked about this trip and what the importance was and how we should be coming back to this land to not only honor and pay homage to those that lived here, but to show people that we are still here. And that's what we're doing. It gives me a great deal of pride to see our people being as one. When I see those buses rolling down the highway with that great big seal on each side of those buses, I know that people are taking notice. That at some point in time, when you and I as Indian people weren't supposed to be here, we're showing them we're still here and we're prospering. We've learned today that as tribal leaders, as leaders of our ceremonial grounds, as leaders of our churches, that if we can depend on the wisdom and the guidance of the Creator, that all things work out. Our old ones used to say, if you will do things and say things from the heart, It's always good. And I see that today. And I believe it was on somebody's heart that we need to do this. 200 years ago, who would have thought that we as Muscogee would be coming back here and not celebrating? The celebration should be that as Muscogee people, we're still here. That we pay homage to those that allows us, those of us that serve in some capacity with our tribal government, to pay homage to them and to thank them, because they set the foundation for us to be where we're at as Muscogee Creek Nation. And I believe that's important. I believe God, our Creator, whether you come from ceremonial grounds or churches, still has a hand on what we do as a nation. Not only Muscogee Creek Nation, but the United States of America as well. Whether this community or communities realizes it or not, but we share a parallel. As Indian people, we don't see land as something that can be bought, can be sold. As Indian people, we see it as something that provides. And as Indian people, we know that we give many acres of lands, millions of acres. I always tease about the fact that all those treaties that were signed, I believe there was invisible ink before there was invisible ink. Because I still see the rivers flowing and the grass being green. But the parallel is, today, you protect this environment. Unfortunately, it took a lot of lives to see the importance of this land. Because as Indian people always knew the importance of land. And I believe that more than ever, where we're at in Oklahoma, we protect our lands and we protect our culture and we protect our language, our tradition. And it's unfortunate that in our homelands, our language is not spoken. We've lost a lot of things because our old ones used to say, when you lose your language, you lose your identity, you lose your culture, you lose your tradition. And we see that here in Alabama. I believe that it's fitting that we have this day today. I don't know if wounds could ever be healed. Only God knows that. Man is not perfect. But as I say in the Muscogee Creek Nation, we strive for perfection, and I think that's with all men. We're not going to always agree, and that's okay. But I believe that today is a good start of knowing where our history lies, where it is. And in the future, as we're making history today, 200 years from now, our following generations, I believe, will say that things are getting better. And I believe that they will. And today is a good start. Moment hayoi, Johoma huidet, Nakokikidra Mijat, Shavachkazit, Mahin was it. Mano Magadanos. I was honored and humbled to stand before you today to tell you and share with you about the Muscogee Creek Nation. And I thank you very much. May the Creator continue to bless our friends and relatives here in Alabama. And may God continue to bless the great Muscogee Creek Nation. My diggers and my Madoketches, thank you very much.
We're going to take a break now, and we're going to continue with our next video